We're very happy this evening to have with us Ms. Gail Pellett and Forbidden Fruit, 1980 Beijing. But to introduce our author, we have a very special guest, the publisher of the Street Smart Van Dam travel guides. Please welcome the publisher, Mr. Stefan Van Dam.
Welcome. It's a great honor to be here and to start this new tour of Gail Pellett's new book, which is the first book in a series on deep travel that charts the journeys of North American journalists traveling and experiencing the world and encountering themselves and other cultures. Ms. Pellett went to Beijing in 1980, and as we will hear here, it made a deep discovery about the Chinese and themselves. I'm also honored to be here in Mitch Kaplan's Cultural Center, which is unique, as you know, in the world, and we're happy for your support, and thank you very much. And I'll give you the one and only Gail Pellett, filmmaker, author, and explorer of many different worlds. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Mitch Kaplan and Books, for inviting me here, and all the people, the staff and the gang that work with you and make this work. I'm going to do several things. One, I'm going to introduce the book a little bit, it's a little context for the book, and then I'm going to read a segment of the book, and then I'm going to sign books for you. So, oh, and we'll have questions somewhere in there. Yeah, so. In 1980, I shipped off to Beijing from New York to be what the Chinese call a foreign expert at Radio Beijing, which is the rough equivalent to Voice of America. And I was invited as the very first experienced broadcast journalist in the 40-year history of that institution. For any of you who know anything about Chinese history, after the Long March, the Communist Party and Mao consolidated power while they lived in caves in Yan'an. And that's where Radio Beijing started, in the caves of Yan'an. So here I am in 1980. I'm the first experienced broadcast journalist to be invited to teach classes in Western style broadcast journalism, American style, and to teach classes and also to edit scripts. A little bit about China in 1980. When I arrived, China was desperately poor, a very different China than today. Food was rationed, housing was rationed, cotton for clothing was rationed, and access to higher education. And it was a pivotal moment because it was in a moment of possibility and transformation because Deng Xiaoping was rising to power with a vision of economic reform and opening to the West. And you see, there had been political movements that had sort of stalled the economic development of China. So I arrived just after the last movement, big political movement, had come to an official close, the Cultural Revolution in 1976. So I arrived at a moment when it's just about to open up for the first time in 30 years. For 3 decades, since what the Chinese refer to as liberation, when the Communist Party took over the country, there were no Western reporters, no Western diplomats, no Western scholars, and no Western tourists. Once the Cultural Revolution sort of came to a close, there was just a sprinkling of people began to go, scholars especially. But when I arrived, the American consulate had just opened 2 years before, in 1978. A sprinkling of American reporters had just set up shop in the Beijing hotel because there were no other facilities or offices for people to be. So some of you are maybe old enough to remember Fox Butterfield of the New York Times was there. So I'm arriving at this very special moment. But what an important part of this book is not only what China is, which I describe a lot of at that time, but who I was then. And I was 37. I was a highly experienced radio journalist at that time. I had been working for 10 years doing both community, public radio, national public radio, commercial radio, and I had just begun working in television. I was also a veteran of 60s movements, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the fresh environmental movement at that time. But despite my expertise in broadcast journalism and my Canadian-American perspective, that I had been hired for this. I grew up in Canada, I then lived in the US for a long time. I was treated as a Western spy. And that creates a huge contradiction in my story and this book. My colleagues, my friends, and most painfully lovers were warned away from me. And so that is a real crisis for me emotionally. But a deeper crisis came in this process, which is that I soon began to learn that everything I was, my essence of my being, was somehow antithetical to being Chinese. As I said, I was 37. I was single. I had no children at that age, and I had a flamboyant personality. I was fiercely independent. Ravenously curious. I had long red curly hair. I was loud. I carried a suitcase filled with jazz and blues cassettes, which was banned music, condemned at that time. And I was doing all this in a country, a conservative culture that respects restraint. And so a parallel kind of crisis attached to that was that all of my ideas about revolution, about politics, about social schemes, about values. I mean, I had grown up in Canada. I had a lot of respect for social democracy. Had then been in all these radical movements. So I had a lot of ideas about politics and revolution going off to China. And my very soul and spirit, all of them were profoundly challenged. So here is this story I'm telling, which is like an emotional arc and an enlightenment arc. I don't know how many of you have been Joseph Campbell fans and think and look about, the heroine's journey from ignorance and naivete through pain and despair and to joy and back again to some kind of enlightenment at the end. But that's my big adventure story in China. So,
Shall we read?
I think I should read a little. I was there for 1 year. I went with a 2-year contract, and I broke the contract and came back after 1 year.
Why would you be considered a spy if you had been invited by them, contacted by them, and you were
You will have to read the book. But I think it helps to understand today. A lot of people have asked me, back 30 years ago, what relevance does it have now? All of the things that were happening then and that I was experiencing have this resonance today. Foreign journalists are treated as spies all the time in China, and I examine that very closely in the history and why that happened in China, because I needed to know. It was devastating as an experience. But I just think before I start to read, there's a couple of questions that people often ask me about the book. One is this very question of, Gail, 1980, 35 years ago, how come you didn't write the book then? And it's a really important question because I did start to write the book then. But I soon came up against what I call the wall of consequences. even the most innocent and stories about my Chinese colleagues and friends and lovers, whatever, could get them into so much trouble because of the policy that forbid relationships between Chinese and foreigners, and particularly foreign journalists. So they could lose a lot, and even if I changed all the names, the massive surveillance of me while I was in China would mean they would know who I was talking about. So with great depression, actually, I packed up all the copies of my letters, all my journals, all my diaries, all my photographs, put them in a big box and shoved them under my desk. And for 30 years, that box kind of kept humming and thumping, you know, while I was carrying on with my life. The other question that people often ask me is, Gail, you're a journalist. How come you're writing a memoir? Well, we write memoirs to make sense of our lives, to derive meaning from our experiences, to be able to reflect on our lives. And therefore, memoirs have been written since the beginning of writing, practically. You know, we don't need to start at the very beginning, but we could start with St. Augustine. We could go to Thoreau in the 19th century, Virginia Woolf in the early 20th, James Baldwin and Maxine Kingston in the middle of the 20th century. But for the last 25 years, there's been an explosion of memoirs. And with that explosion and that could be a whole other discussion, we could have another evening, but with that explosion has come also questions about veracity, about truthfulness, and there have been scandals around certain memoirs. There are some critics who will say anything that's written from memory is fiction. There are others who will say memoirists go for emotional truths. They are the deepest truths. It's up to you as readers to decide and figure out, you know, the veracity and truthfulness of it. Because I am a journalist, I have no choice but to do a fusion and a hybrid of journalism and memoir. So again, you'll let me know if it's successful or not. The other question people often ask is, how did you get to China? I answer that in the first chapter of the book. So, do we have questions before I read, or should I read first and then I'll read a section first and then we can. I have to sit down to read. I'm sorry because
you want to sit
I
here?
just well no, I need to sit at the table because I can't hold the book.
Let me
talk.
get you a high chair and you can sit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just see if I've got a. Oh, I could do that. Yeah. You have a high chair?
Yeah, right on.
Oh, great. That's
You want
great.
some water?
Yeah, that would be helpful. Good. Oh, perfect. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, because I have to take you back to another place. Time. Uh-oh. I'm going to have to figure out what to do with my legs and knees. I'm a leg crosser. Okay. I can't keep it here, though. Oh, there it is. There. Is that a good place or there? Oh, that's it. No, there. Yeah. Good. Okay. Tears froze on my cheeks as Gobi Desert winds hurled a mix of grit and coal dust like tiny shards of glass into my eyes. A cotton face mask prevented me from gulping in the mix. I could barely feel my feet pumping on my one-speed Shanghai Phoenix. Few bicyclists were on the streets at this hour. An occasional Soviet-era Volga passed as I pedaled from pool to pool at a streetlight. It was a strain to push on in my bundle of clothing, blue jeans under my baggy People's Liberation Army pants, then 3 layers of sweaters under my black cotton padded jacket with the stand-up collar. That's what old men wear, the comrades told me at the office. I found the long PLA padded coats too cumbersome for bicycling. In this numbing, life-sucking, bitter wind, I conceded to the padded army hat with the ear flaps. Only my eyes would reveal the truth, that I was a Waigworen, a foreigner, an outsider. In the dark on this withering night, I doubted whether anyone could see my Western boots or my starved libido. The excitement of a forbidden invitation to a local guy's apartment was pushing adrenaline through my veins and resurrecting my torpid mojo, despite the plunging temperatures and 7 kilometers to his building. Whether from the exertion of bicycling and all this padding or the anticipation of going to an illicit rendezvous, I could feel the moisture forming between my breasts. I visualized steam underneath my sweaters and pants. Ming had instructed me to wear the local uniform. I had been hanging on to my New York wardrobe to bolster my identity crisis here. By this time, I did not resist the pressure to conform. And although he had looked doubtful about my navigational skills when he pointed out his street corner on my Beijing map, it was along one of my regular bike routes and was by now a deeply grooved mental map directing my legs to overcome isolation, loneliness, and despair. I had been in Beijing for 4 months and had already learned sad and frustrating lessons about the bizarre policy that separated foreigners from the Chinese, and the surveillance and fear that made it work. The Chinese could lose the most: jobs, housing, and worse. If they were suspected of discussing state secrets, who knew what they were, they could go to jail. And even though I had been invited to work as a foreign expert at Central Broadcasting precisely for my broadcast journalism skills, the fact that I was a journalist had sent out huge warning flares to all the Chinese around me. It was as if I had a tattoo in psychedelic paint spelling spy across my forehead. I felt as if I were radioactive. I could be arrested and deported if the government intelligence gatherers, who were everywhere, discovered I was meeting secretly with a Chinese man. Already, other Chinese acquaintances had been warned away from me. I had met Ming in unusual circumstances, far away from the party informants among my comrades at Radio Beijing and the spying eyes and ears at the building where I lived. When he invited me to visit his apartment, I was stunned. First because it meant defying a potent government policy, but also because of the housing crisis. I was puzzled how a young single man, a student, could procure an apartment for himself. Throughout the city, several generations were crammed into 1 and 2 rooms with shared kitchens and bathrooms. Even young married couples sometimes had to live separately, with parents or in singles dorms. How did Ming pull off his own apartment? He had to be part of that maligned category that the comrades referred to while frowning: the spoiled sons of high cadres. That too aroused me. I knew my attraction to him was superficial. Since we didn't share a language, we acted out all of our conversations in childish charades and furious dictionary consultations. But his kinetic humor broke through the dirty screen doors of the language barrier. He also had a seductive face, round with full lips and mischievous eyes. Even if he were 10 years younger, how could I resist this opportunity? I was ecstatic. At the corner, hunched against the wind, buried in layers of army garb, he was waiting. Ming seemed both nervous and pleased that I was decked out in Chinese drag. Not a stray, long, curly red hair leaked from underneath my hat. Surely I could get away with passing a neighbor or two at the entrance of his building. But then, while biting his lip, he motioned me to the back of the building. We were plunged into darkness, looking in all directions. He then checked to see if the fire escape was clear and motioned me ahead. Was I making a horrible mistake? Would he rob me, imprison me, or worse? I tamped down those thoughts. We crept up the unlit stairway, a hazardous course, since tenants had tied their bicycles to the railings and stored stuff on the landings. When we reached the 4th floor, He waved his arms no in front of the entrance, later explaining that he shared a kitchen in the hall with another family. He then beckoned me to follow him through the window off the stairwell. Was I crazy? At the age of 37, I was sneaking into the apartment of a much younger guy in Beijing through the window? Was this a blinking neon sign of how far I had regressed here? Zoba, let's go, he said. An avalanche of fear flooded my serpent brain. Was he going to turn out to be a rapist or axe murderer? Would I disappear, my body parts found years later? That panic fused with the thrill of attempting something profoundly illegal. Bicycling to Ming's apartment in this brutal weather, padded in PLA layers, sneaking up the fire escape, crawling through a fourth floor window, I felt like I was about to score some drugs. Contraband. And then, yes then, it felt quite natural. Of course. How else could we do this? An older Western woman visiting a much younger Chinese guy. How else but through a window? As I plunged headfirst through that window, I realized I would have to exit through that window too. Only later would I understand this wickedly naughty act as a search for transcendence of all that was denied here. Free association, critical thoughts, lascivious thoughts, the sensual, desire, passion. Pitching through that window became a metaphor for my belief that it might be possible to make a deep connection with the forbidden, with the radical other. We might find we had something in common. Lust? Was that finally what enlightenment about the other meant? Was that too personal, too selfish a need? Was I evading the more profound question of whether we could truly understand another culture, another history? Perhaps, too, I was simply determined to be free. After all, the personal is political. That's the prologue to the book. So we could take some questions, and then I will sign some books. If any of you have questions, I will try to answer yes.
You said you were there at the end of the Cultural Revolution?
The Cultural Revolution ended in 1976 when Mao died, and Zhou Enlai died, and the Gang of Four were arrested.
And it was actually said that was over?
Yes, it was by the time I arrived, they had officially designated it over in 1976 with the arrest of the Gang of Four, really. Yeah, but it was also the same year that Mao and Zhou Enlai died. Yeah.
When did Kissinger travel?
72, but it took another 6 years for diplomatic relationships to really open up. The Canadians were a little bit ahead, so they opened up their consulate a couple of years or 3 years before the Americans did, and had reporters there. Some who were already sent packing them back home because of reporting on things that were forbidden. So.
You talk about how your experience there shook you in a lot of different ways, but including your own political sensibility.
Yes.
And I suppose that's because the West, during the 60s particularly, was so enamored with Mao. And
with the Cultural
and with the
Revolution.
culture. And when you go and you actually were up close and personal with it, you saw how repressive and how kind of deadening it was.
Yes, yes. No, you put that very well. I do talk about the influence of the Cultural Revolution on my generation of 60s activists. Perhaps from radical therapists, psychotherapists, to theater people, but most profoundly perhaps to the Black Panther Party. And I was part of all of that. I was in that milieu, and so because we didn't have any real reporters on the ground in China in those years, it was very hard. Scholars were interviewing exiles and refugees in Hong Kong, and that's what we knew, but it was very scanty and spotty, but we had this, the Cultural Revolution began with some wonderful ideas. Egalitarian, democracy at the base, roots, grassroots of people, challenging education as elitist. That influenced me when I was in grad school. I mean, we were very tough on our professors and challenging them all the time about the relevancy of the curriculum, of what we were studying, etc. But we weren't beating up our professors and we weren't killing them. And that was a huge difference, of course. And then the Cultural Revolution got very complicated after the first couple of years and got very sectarian and became manipulated by all kinds of groups. And that's when Mao decided to send all the young people to remote regions of the country to sort of get rid of some of that, but it still continued on in many ways. But yes, so I felt, and I describe in one place in the book, that I felt that among my colleagues at Radio Beijing, that I was working among ghosts, the living ghosts of the Cultural Revolution, who were, I think, still in a state of shock and stunned from what had gone on, because it affected every institution, Radio Beijing as well. And you know, the takeovers and the you know, the punishing of people and persecuting people, and the cult of Mao, you know, all those things. So yes,
the Cultural Revolution seemed to be very successful in the sense that it actually did strip away so much of the culture that was China. You know,
destroyed.
Well,
they tried. Yes, there was a lot of destruction.
I was there, I guess, in '93 I was invited to go on a publishing. It's when they were opening up the world to publishing and bookselling, and I was the bookseller who was a publisher of others.
Yes.
And it was a very strange time. There was only one hotel in all of Beijing. There was a tourist hotel. But what I discovered, and I had a very similar experience in the sense that what was happening by that time, so that was 13 years after you were there,
yes.
is
and
that
after Tiananmen Square.
Right.
When there was an effort.
It was before Tiananmen.
Well, then that was in '89.
Right.
Tiananmen was in '89, so you were there in '83 or '90.
No, it was after. It was after.
Yeah, because it's right about the time when the economy is going to really take off.
But what
It's
happened
right about
was,
then.
it was so bizarre because it was as if capitalism came rushing in to this country that had no context. So we would go. I remember going into the tourism store where foreigners could go, and they had gold American Express cards for sale with a picture of Chairman Mao right in the middle of it. I mean, it was as if, you know, everything was gone wild.
Yes.
And you would
Yes.
see these little farmhouses with black Lexuses parked out front of it in the countryside. So it was unfettered capitalism, which can only happen if you don't have any cultural roots to really fall back on.
Or you don't have a legal system in place.
Well, there's a lot of that.
No, because this is, well, I discuss so much of this, all of this in the book, because I was, again, there at this pivotal moment when I would go into the one hotel in town that had the bar. I forgot to add that I was the hard drinking woman as well in all this, you know, and there was one, you know, we knew that already, and there was in a one-bar town, which was what we called the milk bar in the lobby of the Beijing hotel, in the middle, brightly lit in the middle of the jewelry store in the Beijing hotel. But it was a historic spot because that's where, you know, I would go in some days and I'd see an American man with his head in his hands, and he's trying to do some deal. You know, it's the beginning of the deal making. The American businessmen are arriving, and they don't know, they've been negotiating, they have no idea what they've agreed to or what the Chinese don't want to take any responsibility, the Americans will take all of it, whatever. They're selling everything from toys to nuclear reactors, right? And so it was that moment, but the real economic boom didn't take off until after Tiananmen Square, and it happened for a reason, of course, and because of it sort of to wipe out the memory of Tiananmen Square.
Have you returned?
Have I returned? Yes, I've been back a couple of times in the 2000s.
See that?
Yes, yes. I mean, I knew what had taken place because I have other friends who go back and forth regularly and things, yes.
Is this your first trip to Asia?
Was it my first? Yes.
To that part of the world?
Yes, it was my first trip to Asia.
What were some of those first encounter moments that you said, oh, they do it like that. Oh,
You're going to have
that's
to read the book
different.
because it's just filled with that.
Can you tell us just one of them?
I don't know whether I can pull one out of the haystack of that. There was so much, yeah. Because as I said, you know, I embraced who I was, my personality. You know, this Western wild woman, independent, and all of that. You know, I was talkative, I was opinionated, I liked to argue. I couldn't get, you know, any of that going or happening with the Chinese. So it was a tremendous confrontation.
So it was more from them. Was it just listening, or was it just agreeing and a nod? Yes.
No, they were not. My colleagues were not supposed to be seen ever having a private conversation with me. I mean, I go through a lot of this in the book. It's disorienting because I was a journalist. It took me a while to understand that I wasn't working in a journalistic institution. I mean, I learned pretty quickly, but that most of my colleagues had all been hired out of foreign language school. They were all translators. Nobody knew how at that point sort of how to do an interview or write or anything because they were simply translating scripts. I've one day discovered the smoke-filled room where all the guys sat who created all the scripts. Because we could never fact check anything. We could never, most of them didn't have bylines. They were like, and I described it, they were like reading magazine articles on the air. And often they would say on the air, this is an article, but you know, from, you know, Women in China, right, the magazine or something. And, but with no byline and no way to check it. And then I discovered, because we were all told to bring shortwave radios to China. I brought my shortwave, I'm listening, and one night I'm listening on all the humming and buzzing dials all over the world, bringing in Korea and things. I land on Moscow, and I know where the Chinese learned their approach to radio Beijing scripts. It was the same flat reading an article on the air. And I guess it was just the safe way to do because the scripts always came from somewhere else. You know, they weren't generated out of the departments or by individuals that were, so.
Back in the early 70s, I worked in Thailand. And I came face to face with the concept of losing face. Which a Thai will do anything so that you as a foreigner do not lose face in their country because you're a guest.
Yes.
Did you have something similar happen to you in
I
China?
lost face so many times that it was, you know, devastating. Yeah. I was continually losing face, losing my temper. You know, I was, you know, embarrassing myself, humiliating myself. Yeah.
How did the language barrier go? Because you said you didn't speak Chinese after 4 months there.
Yeah, well, I think this is such a big question, and it's one of the things that I address at the end of the book. I think that there was a history before me, before the revolution, of Western journalists going to China who never knew a word of Chinese, who couldn't speak or read Mandarin, and yet reported officially from China for major newspapers in this country. And I might have been the tail end of the time period in which anybody could have the hubris of thinking you would go to China and have any kind of meaningful experience without having some kind of language skills before you arrived. It came up so suddenly, the opportunity for me. I was, you know, and I moved on it by impulse, and I went for it. I didn't read, speak, I didn't study, I wasn't a Chinese scholar. And so I talk about what that meant to live as an illiterate because I was a journalist.
Yeah.
And here I was an illiterate in this country.
Did any of the Chinese people speak English?
Well, I worked in the English language department of Radio Beijing.
Okay.
See, it's because it's like Voice of America. They broadcast in 49 languages or whatever. And I was and I considered myself a Deng Xiaoping hire, that because they had hired me with broadcast journalism experience, that was important for the first time because they were opening to the West. But then the contradiction was that there was no way to really sort of mesh the experiences or the notion of that being a journalistic institution. And it's very interesting what's happening right now. I have actually written a number of blogs about the missing Hong Kong publishers, and I just had an article published yesterday in a blog that is called Three Quarks Daily. If you don't know about this blog, it's wonderful because they congregate articles from all over on history, science, math, arts, culture, a broad range of ideas and things. And I wrote a piece about forbidden history, forbidden subjects, forbidden ideas, because there's a continuum. When I arrived, it wasn't new. Everything was forbidden during the Cultural Revolution, but there were forbidden subjects, forbidden history in terms of the scripts that I was editing and things, and of course forbidden music, forbidden relationships, but that continued on, and President Xi Jinping now has just is doing a new campaign of ideological control over Chinese media and certainly over foreign media and scholarship functioning in China or not. And of course the biggest forbidden is the World Wide Web and the internet in terms of a block. But where I'm getting off, you were asking me a question that I got
Just about
drifted.
the language in English.
The language, well, yes, hubris, and I do talk about it at the end of the book. It took,
We got a question here.
Yeah.
You mentioned you were seen as a spy, and it seems like the premise of your memoir is that you were perceived by others as involved in clandestine activities.
yes.
Is this a response that's prevalent among the Chinese women or the Chinese men?
Well-
What's prevalent among, in terms of the gender difference or gender bias?
Well, I think that it seemed to be in both women and men, certainly, but certainly men, because near the end of the book, I talk about developing a relationship with a very famous general, powerful general's son, and that relationship was banned. So that was really, very forbidden. So.
And is actually people monitoring all this?
Oh, yeah.
Huh.
But in those days, much less sophisticated than we have now. I mean, I think also now the surveillance is so deeply penetrating everywhere in our lives, here and there. But in those days, it was a lot of little chits of paper with all the officials, and it was the reporting by people. And I think a culture of mistrust and fear and reporting on, and what I call is sort of a sickening, it's the ratting. And I don't know whether the Chinese learned it from the Soviets or not. There is some speculation about that. The East Germans certainly developed it to a high degree. And that mistrust, it creates such a profound, I think, illness in a society and culture when you can't trust. You can't, I made such efforts to try to develop relationships with Chinese men and women. And one girlfriend, Chinese girlfriend at the end said, during the Cultural Revolution, she had gone into a bathroom. She was being profoundly persecuted, and she went into a bathroom and somebody whispered something to her. And that was later reported. Somebody else heard that. It's that kind of thing that, you don't know whether the people were encouraged, if they developed a relationship with a foreigner, they were encouraged then to be on the good side with the party, to report on who that foreigner is spending time with. So you then began to think, who are the people who are willing to associate with me? Can I trust them? And that begins to sow the seeds of mistrust in you. That's why I felt I had to leave.
Yeah.
You know, I
you
couldn't.
You must have felt rather isolated.
Oh, there are some people in this room who have already read the book, so they will. Yep.
Well, the real clue for me is
Yeah.
that you, of all people, only survived there a year.
A
And you
year.
were so intrepid. I can't imagine many of your colleagues who were on that kind of timetable of 2 years managed to get through the 2 years, or went home
No.
basket cases.
Yeah. No.
Well, I think there is also a difference of people actually that are very often moving among foreigners.
Yes.
So for an American to go and insert herself right in the middle of a very Chinese environment.
Yeah, I didn't
That's-
travel to what in those days felt to me like the backside of the moon, because we knew nothing about China really. I didn't travel that far to hang out with people from Chicago and, Toronto and stuff. I didn't, even though those relationships became important in ways, but I kept charging at that wall.
Talk about your trip, your first trip on the train to
Tianjin.
where the earthquake. Had
Oh,
been.
yes, yes.
That was,
Yeah. Well, I took a trip. I felt so controlled at the office that within a month and a half, I wanted to get away for a weekend and I tried to pick out somewhere on the map that I could get a train to easily in a couple of hours. Even though we worked a 6-day week, I had to ask for an extra day off to do this. And I took a train trip to Tianjin. I didn't realize till I got there, this was the city that had been devastated in an earthquake in 1976, 4 years before. It was as if nothing had happened since the earthquake. Rubble was still everywhere, all the broken buildings, people living in the streets in the most dystopian sort of conditions. And it was so shocking and sort of depressing. I had remembered the stories at the time, and any of you who may have recalled that the Chinese refused the help of the Red Cross and people like that because they didn't want anybody, didn't trust anybody to come in. I gather today Tianjin is back being an extraordinary business hub. It was a port city very close to Beijing, so always an important city. So, yeah, lots of experiences. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you so much. For those of you that are watching online, don't forget, give us a call here. We'll get a book autograph for you, and we'll ship it to you. Can we get another round of applause for our author? That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you. And we do have the books are for sale behind the counter. If you'd like to purchase your copy, she will sign them right over here at this table. We thank you so much for coming.